In this video, we'll discuss about Introduction to Five Kingdom Classification. When you look at the definition for the biological classification, it's a systematic arrangement of millions of organisms present on the earth into various groups according to their similarities as well as the differences. Then coming to the applications of the classification, which help us to define the various organisms and to understand the diversity in a better way and to know the origin as well as evolution of the different kinds of the organisms. Then coming to the history of the biological classification, so initially the people they started classifying the organisms based on their uses, like the animals which are giving the food, the organisms providing us the shelter, as well as based on the clothing. So for the first time Aristotle started classifying the organisms into plants as well as animals with some scientific inputs. Further he classified plants into herbs, shrubs as well as the trees. In the same way, in the case of the animals, he classified animals with blood as well as animals without blood. After Aristotle, Carl Linnaeus, with more scientific inputs, then he classified organisms into two categories called as the kingdom Plantae as well as the kingdom Animaliae. But here these two kingdom classification is with so many limitations. The Linnaeus he did not differentiate the eukaryotic organisms from the prokaryotic organisms as well as unicellular and multicellular organisms and the photosynthetic as well as non-photosynthetic organisms while classifying the organisms into these two kingdoms. So one way we can say that the two kingdom classification is not sufficient to keep all organisms. So we can see certain the well noted errors we can see here. So like the bacteria, blue-green algae, fungi, mosses, ferns, gymnosperms and the angiosperms. He placed all these organisms under the single kingdom called as the plant kingdom. The reason for keeping all these organisms under the single kingdom is all these organisms they possess the cell wall. But here later the scientific community people realize that the composition of the cell wall will be different in the case of the different organisms. For example, in the case of the fungi, that is made with the chitin. In the case of the plants, that is made with cellulose. And in the case of the bacteria, the cell wall is made with peptidoglycan. In these two kingdom classification, still we can see some more errors like placing the organisms which are having a different kind of the features under the single kingdom. While classifying all these organisms, Linnaeus he did not consider the type of the cell, number of the cells as well as the nutrition in the case of the organisms. Just he considered only one point, that is the presence or absence of the cell wall. For example, if you observe from the same group which includes prokaryotic as well as eukaryotic cell organisms in the same group, for example, then the bacteria and cyanobacteria, these are the examples for the prokaryotic organisms, as well as fungi and algae, these are the example for the eukaryotic organisms. Even though the type of the cell present in the organisms are different, but he placed all these organisms under the kingdom Plantae. Then other error is even he did not differentiate the number of cells present in the case of the organisms, like some both unicellular organisms as well as multicellular organisms he placed under the single kingdom. So unicellular organisms like Chlamydomonas as well as multicellular organisms like Spirogyra, he placed both organisms under the same kingdom. Then coming to the nutrition also, while classifying the organisms, Linnaeus did not consider about the mode of nutrition in the case of the organisms. So in the same group, some of the organisms, they are heterotrophic in nature and some of the organisms are autotrophic in nature. So when you look at that heterotrophs present in the case of the group, that includes fungi. Autotrophic organisms include the green plants as well as some of the photosynthetic bacteria. So without differentiating all these factors, without considering all these parameters, then he places all these organisms under the single kingdom, like organisms like bacteria, blue-green algae, fungi, mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms, all organisms he placed under the single kingdom, the plantae. So these are the errors. Other scientists, then they try to classify the organisms by considering multiple parameters, like the habitat, means the place where they are living, and the morphology, and the structure of the cell, nature of the cell wall, and the mode of reproduction, and the reproduction methods, as well as evolutionary relationship. Based on all these characters, other scientists, they try to classify the organisms into the different groups. Among all these, the mostly or widely accepted classification is the five kingdom classification proposed by R.H. Whittaker in 1969. So as per R.H. Whittaker, the five kingdoms include the Monera and the Protista and the fungi, plantae, as well as animalia. So under the kingdom Monera, he placed all unicellular prokaryotic organisms like bacteria. Then under the Protista, he placed all unicellular eukaryotic organisms. Then under the fungi, he placed the multicellular organisms, heterotrophic organisms, whose cell wall is made with chitin, placed under the kingdom fungi. Still under the fungi, limited number of unicellular organisms are also present. All these unicellular fungi placed under the group called as the yeast. Then under the plant kingdom, then he placed all multicellular eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, and under the animalia, then he placed eukaryotic multicellular heterotrophic organisms. Under the kingdom Monera, he placed two subkingdoms, archaebacteria as well as the bacteria. This archaebacteria are the organisms which live in all the extreme environmental conditions due to the specific characteristic tRNAs as well as RNAs, and usually they lack peptidoglycan cell wall, whereas all other the bacterial members, they contain the peptidoglycan in the cell wall. So here the archaebacteria that shows bacterial attributes as well as eukaryotic, the features also that shows. When compared to two kingdom classification, five kingdom classification is more superior. Then this we can observe the way how the organisms are classified and placed under the kingdom Protista. For example, like the organisms like Chlamydomonas and Chlorella, earlier they are placed in the kingdom called as the plants. The reason for or the criteria is due to the presence of the cell wall in their the cells. While the organisms like Paramecium and the amoeba, in two kingdom classification, these are placed under the animal kingdom. The reason is due to the absence of cell wall in their cells. So finally, Chlamydomonas, Chlorella, Paramecium and amoeba, all these together they placed under the kingdom called as the Protista, because R.H. Whittaker considered more than one point for keeping all these organisms, like these are the organisms which contain unicellular as well as eukaryotic organisms. When compared with the R.H. Whittaker's five kingdom classification, then recently Carl Woese, he classified the organisms into three domains based on the 16S rRNA sequence. So when he compared the 16S rRNA sequence of the archaebacteria, bacteria and the eukaryotic organisms, he realized that the archaebacterial 16S rRNA sequence is more closer to the eukaryotic organisms than the bacteria. So the archaebacteria, which is present as a subkingdom under the Monera. He promoted this archaebacteria as a new domain called as archaea. So overall, he divided kingdom Monera into two domains called archaea as well as bacteria. Then other one is the eukaryota. Under the archaea, he placed the kingdom called as archaebacteria, and under the bacteria, he placed the kingdom called eubacteria. Then under the eukaryota, he placed the kingdoms like the protista, fungi, plantae as well as animalia.